Good day, everyone. I am Jari Trisha Bedulit, and together with my groupmates, we'll be continuing the discussion about the critical approaches in critiquing. But before we move to our discussion, let us first know our learning objectives. First, identify the critical approaches used in writing a critic. Second, distinguish the features of the different critical approaches used in writing a critic. And lastly, analyze sample critiques and determine the critical approach used by the writer.
A pleasant day, everyone. Since you already know what critiquing means, let us continue discussing the other critical approaches in critiquing. Let us begin with historical criticism. Historical criticism is an approach in literary criticism that seeks to understand a literary work by examining its historical, social, cultural, and intellectual context, including the author's background and environment. It simply means that historical criticism explains a literary work by looking at the historical events such as society, culture, ideas, and the author's experiences that influenced it when it was written. The main focus of historical criticism is the context outside the text. This includes the time period when the work was written and the author's background and experiences. By understanding these outside influences, we can better understand why the literary work was written and what message it wants to convey. To understand the context outside the text, historical criticism examines historical events such as social and cultural conditions, political and intellectual ideas, and the author's background and environment. These factors help explain the themes and ideas and messages presented in the literary work. For example, the Noli Me Tangere. It was written during the Spanish colonial period and shows injustice and oppression experienced by many Filipinos. The novel was also influenced by Jose Rizal's experiences and observations of society. By understanding this historical context, the meaning and purpose of the novel become clearer. Now, let us move on to structuralism. Structuralism is an approach in literary criticism that examines how the elements of a text are connected and how these relationships create meaning within the work. It simply means that structuralism explains a literary work by looking at how its different elements work together to create meaning. The main elements of structuralism are characters, plot, setting, conflict, theme, and symbols. These elements do not work separately. Instead, they are interconnected and together they develop the events, theme, and overall meaning of the story. In short, the focus of structuralism is the text itself. It explains that the meaning of a literary work comes from the relationships among its elements and how they work together within the text. For example, in Romeo and Juliet, the characters are Romeo, Juliet, and their families, while the conflict is the rivalry between the two families. The story takes place in Verona, and the plot centers on Romeo and Juliet's secret or forbidden relationship. All these elements work together to create a theme of love and tragedy, showing that the meaning of the story comes from the relationship among its elements. Now, here's Jara to explain the other critical approach.
Good day, everyone. Today, I will discuss about sociocultural criticism. So, what is sociocultural criticism? Sociocultural criticism is a literary approach that studies how a story, poem, or any literary work is connected to the society and culture in which it was written. The word socio means society or people living together, while cultural refers to a group's beliefs, traditions, values, and way of life. Therefore, sociocultural criticism examines how these social and cultural factors influence a literary work. In simple terms, this approach helps us understand what story tells us about real life. It looks at how the characters, events, and the themes reflect the customs, beliefs, problems, and experiences of people in a particular society. When using sociocultural criticism, we ask questions such as what social issues are shown in the story, what cultural beliefs or traditions are presented, how does the story reflect society where it was written. For example, in Noli Me Tangere, we can see social issues such as inequality, abuse of power, and the struggles of Filipinos during Spanish colonial period. Through this approach, we can better understand the society and culture reflected in the novel. The importance of sociocultural criticism is that it helps us connect literature to real-life experiences. It allows us to understand different cultures, recognize social issues, and appreciate how literature reflects the lives of people. To summarize, sociocultural criticism is the study of how literature reflects society and culture. It helps us understand the values, traditions, beliefs, and social issues shown in a literary work. Now, let's discuss our next topic. Our next topic is reader response criticism. Reader response criticism is a literary approach that focuses on the reader's interpretation of a text. It believes that a story, poem, or novel does not have only one fixed meaning. Instead, the meaning is created when the reader reads and interprets the text. Now, let's look at its three main ideas. First is subjectivity. This means that every reader has different experiences, beliefs, and emotions. Because of this, people may understand the same story in different ways. Second is interaction. Reading is like a conversation between the reader and the text. The meaning is created when the reader connects the story with their own experiences. Third is interpretive communities. This means that people with similar culture, education, or background often interpret the story in similar ways because they share similar experiences. Now, let's talk about the major theorists. Louise Rosenblatt believed that the meaning is created through the interaction between the reader and the text. Wolfgang Iser believed that readers use their imagination to understand the parts of a story that are not fully explained. Stanley Fish believed that our culture, background, and the groups we belong to influence how we interpret a text. For example, imagine a story about a student who leaves home to study in another city. One reader may think the story is about becoming independent. Another reader may think it is about making sacrifices to achieve success. Both interpretations are correct because they are based on the reader's own experiences and are supported by the story. To summarize, the main focus of reader response criticism is the reader. It teaches us that different readers can have different but meaningful interpretations of the same literary work.
So the next is the psychological criticism. So psychological criticism is a critical approach to literature that employs psychological theories to examine aspects of literary work as a way to better understand both the author's mind and characters, themes, and other elements of the text. Thus, the mind is the center of our target as we learn more about psychological criticism. This approach draws on theories and concepts from psychology, such as psychoanalysis and behavioral psychology, to analyze literary works. Now, there are two ways to focus our psychological reading of a text. We could focus on the author and talks about how the text reveals the psychology of the author, or more likely, we can focus on the psychology of the characters. What motivates the characters to perform the actions they do? So how does psychological criticism work? How do we do it? Well, there are two ways to do this. First, use a psychological theory. If you're already familiar with psychology, you can directly apply the theories to the text. Second, ask psychological questions. A good psychological question just gets into the mind of the character. It tries to understand why a character does what he or she does. For example, why do the characters react the way they do? How have the characters' lives and backgrounds influenced their actions? What kind of personalities do they have? So the last critical approach is the Marxist criticism. So Marxist criticism is concerned with differences between economic classes and implications of a capitalist system, such as the continuing conflict between the working class and the elite. Hence, it attempts to reveal that the ultimate source of people's experience is the socio-economic system. So Marxist criticism emphasizes on how power, politics, and money play a role in literary texts and amongst literary societies and characters. So its focus is on how power, class, race, and economic status affect the content and theme of a certain work. So in what way did the story or movie reflect the socioeconomic status of the characters? Simply put, Marxism says power and money are root of society's struggle. For example, the story or movie Hunger Games. The Hunger Games is an example of Marxist criticism because it portrays a society divided by class. The capital, which represents the ruling class, enjoys wealth and power, while the districts experience poverty and exploitation. The story highlights class inequality, the abuse of power, and the struggle of oppressed people to resist and change the unjust system.
That's all for our discussion today. Thank you for listening.